I am now going to tell you every essential you need to survive the early game, starting from the easiest to the hardest to apply. But be careful, if you miss one you might not come across these tips for a long time, so listen up. Despite the early game being the shortest part of the game, it's where most people make their biggest mistakes, but in today's video I'm going to correct all of them. But with FNCS coming up, we need to get into it immediately. Let's kick things off with point number 1. Drop height. However, we need to be careful because this is a controversial one. While some people say it doesn't matter what's under us when gliding, others suggest that trees, mountains, etc. do affect our drop height. We'll get back to that in a second, but first we need to discuss the two ways of landing. The first, when uncontested. It's generally beneficial to stay a bit higher to get that extra knowledge of where others are located, and also where the best loot is. This way, if you are really not trying to fight people who landed near you, you still have the option to glide to another possible drop spot whilst others have already chose theirs. The second, however, is the complete opposite. When contested, try landing as fast and as low as you can, ensuring that you are the person who gets the first weapon on that landing spot. This is incredibly beneficial because not only are you already armed, but if you've mastered your drop enough, you can also tag people who are still gliding, giving you a huge head start before they've even landed. Remember the controversy if trees and mountains affect the height at which the umbrella is deployed at? Well, new research shows that these objects do affect the deployment of the umbrella, so just keep that in mind. Show this to that one friend who always told you otherwise. For our next point, choosing our exact landing spot inside a POI. For this point, we have something special which nobody else currently has in the game, and that something is a way to improve all of these points mentioned in this video without even having to watch it. And that is LandWars, a one-to-one copy of fencing fields that improves not only your early game decision-making, but also your sense for the game like no other. Make sure to next time you are playing, check it out, I'm sure you'll not regret it. Back to the video. When choosing which house to land on, you'll have to take a couple of things into consideration. First and foremost, which house contains the most loot, easily farmable materials, and is in the advantageous position on a map. A good example of such a house is the blue roof house in fencing fields. Not only does it provide you with lots of materials and loot, but is also located on the side of the POI with a relatively high roof, meaning you'll have the height advantage and won't be surprised from the back as easily as if you would being in the middle of the POI. Okay, so far we've covered drop height, contested versus uncontested, land wars, and what makes an advantageous landing spot. But from now we'll get into deeper waters. These following points will need extra thought and also consciousness of your actions during the game. Point 3 is going to be looting path, although you'll most likely have to figure out your own, and it is kind of boring. On the flip side, it can be applied with a few rules easily, unlike some advanced things later down the line in this video. Here are the most essential things that your path will have to include. Most importantly, lots of loot and chest spawns, and secondly, easily accessible materials. Of course, these looting paths won't be the same every game, but it's still very beneficial to know a way to get your hands on good loot. Although this next point, in my opinion, is the hardest, I thought I would share it not because that many people could apply it, but because the ones who can will hugely benefit from it. So point 4, advantage and disadvantage. Now, why is this hard to apply? Not only is it ever-changing and hardly predictable, but it's also subjective. But that's why, along with point number 3, I made up a rule for the early game that you can follow. If on your looting path you found a shotgun assault rifle and shields with at least 250 mats within the first few minutes of the game, you are considered to be in an advantageous situation. Although this rule is going to be good to hang by in the early game, the more efficient but harder way to apply this rule to really get the most of it is to keep yourself accountable and analyze every decision you make. Look at it logically and disengage if not in an advantageous situation. Although this rule requires constant focus and logicality, this will make or break a player. A good way to practice this in a more compact environment is my map LandWars. Make sure to practice this in the coming weeks and see yourself placing better and better in tournaments. Lastly, I've brought some easily applicable tips to your gameplay which don't need much explanation but can make you 2 times better, meaning they are the most worth it to apply to your gameplay. Number 1 is my favorite. Since in the early game Noon has lots of extra heals and shields, make sure to chip damage your opponent every time you see them. After doing this 2 to 3 times, not only will you find yourself in that advantageous situation discussed earlier, but you will also have extremely good knowledge of where your enemies are during the whole early game since you are constantly looking for the angles to hit them. Just like advantage and disadvantage, this is a rule that requires conscious thought during the game. Keep that in mind. Number 2 is very simple and known but often neglected. Just make sure to always check your mats and get as much as you can in the early game, because during fights, you are used to having lots of it. Well, not in the early game. Be very cautious and always look at how much you've got left. Extra tip number 3. The last one is going to being aware of where close by teams landed, making sure that if you have that advantageous position and decide to engage in a fight, you won't get third-partied. Although it's great to apply these things, make sure to not forget one thing: whether you play competitively or casually, it's not the end result that will make you happy, but the process to get there, so make sure you enjoy it and make the most of it. Thank you for contributing to the growth of this channel. If you feel like you've learned something new today, consider giving a like, and I'll see you the next time. Peace.